Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for October 29th, 2024. The topic for this morning is suggested by some comments made by Helga Zepp-LaRouche yesterday on the dangerous stupidity of geopolitics. From the Kazan, Russia BRICS summit, we have a report from my colleagues there of a question they posed to Anton Kobyakov, who is an advisor to President Putin. They asked him, can the Western establishment be convinced to participate positively in developing a new security and development architecture? And Kobyakov said, quote, "We hope very much for that. Our president, Putin, talks about that always. The main thing," he continued, "is that Pax Americana," which is a reference to the unipolar order, if it collapses, the main thing is that when it does collapse, that it will not bury all of us under the rubble. Now, there are two things of note in his answer. First, the recognition by the leadership of Russia that it's inevitable that if there's no change in Western policy, the West will collapse. We see it in terms of the economic system, where there's an overwhelming debt burden, which is destroying countries. And it can only be sustained by accelerating the looting of the former colonial sector, which will no longer accept it. The former colonial countries are now saying, we are sovereign nations and will not accept your imperial system. And that's why there's growing support for the BRICS from nations of the global south. Furthermore, the looting will therefore be turned against the population in the Western countries, which is already happening, leading to deindustrialization, for example, in Germany, inflation, and so on. Very significant unhappiness in the Western nations. And the second point of note in that answer is that they're hoping that the West will give up the idea that might makes right, that the use of geopolitical divide and conquer strategy is justified to protect a rules-based order which doesn't exist. They're hoping that the West will recognize that's a course toward failure and would welcome the West joining with the BRICS if that attitude were changed. Now, the question that I want to address for you is, what is geopolitics? What do we mean by that? The British Empire during the 19th century, especially toward the end of the 19th century, felt a threat to their supremacy, which they wanted to suppress. They saw Germany, France, Russia, Japan having significant economic development, which was outstripping that of the British Empire. And then what happened is those countries recognized that the growing economic power of the United States was due to what was called the American system of political economy, national credit, tariffs when necessary, infrastructure investment, for example, the Transcontinental Railroad. This was Abraham Lincoln's policy, which led to a tremendous growth in the United States and was copied by all these other countries. And so the question was, would there be an imperial struggle for supremacy, or would there be collaboration? Now, the British Empire had no desire to collaborate. They wanted to sustain their power. And so through the role of the City of London oligarchy, working with the Fabian Society and other such groupings, put forward a theory by a geographer named Halford Mackinder that essentially said no alliance could be allowed which would threaten British supremacy. And British supremacy was primarily based on sea power. And so the idea of transcontinental connections, such as the Siberian Railway or the Berlin to Baghdad Railway, represented an existential threat to British control of trade and finance. And so the countries that were involved in, that potentially would be involved in a Eurasian alliance, had to be divided. France against Germany, Russia and Germany against each other. That was geopolitics. And 2 world wars resulted from applying the axioms of Mackinder's ideas. Now, after World War II, there was a potential for change, but it was subverted by the Brits and their networks in the United States, such as the Dulles brothers, such as the Harriman Network, the Bush family network, and so on. That this potential was subverted by bringing the United States in as the main enforcer of imperial policy. What LaRouche said oftentimes was America was the dumb giant on a British leash. And this was organized through the integration of corporate cartels as global powers, what Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex, or what is more properly known as Mickey Mat, as Ray McGovern has described it, to include the cartels of Silicon Valley, finance, think tanks, academia, media, and so on. Now, Eisenhower warned against this, and John F. Kennedy responded against it as well. And he moved toward, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, a peace plan, a détente policy with the Soviet Union. This was subverted by the assassination of President Kennedy and the plunging of the United States into a colonial war in Vietnam. The policy since that time has been permanent war, coups, assassinations, sanctions, and divide and conquer. The geopolitical doctrine has been fully adopted by the establishment in both parties in the United States and most of the political parties in Europe, in Western Europe. But now we're reaching the end of that era. It can no longer be sustained. There's not enough loot, and there's too much resistance developing, especially in the global South, and increasingly in Western society. So the question that has to be posed is, who benefits from the domination of geopolitical doctrine? And this is where Lyndon LaRouche's role comes in. LaRouche was consistent in exposing the fact that the geopolitical doctrine favored the financial establishment and the corporate cartels, and that their policy was to subvert any form of alliance for economic development, whether it's national development, regional development, or transcontinental development. And LaRouche led a fight against this, putting forward many regional development plans, for example, the Oasis Plan, to resolve the wars that were continuing in the Middle East. His wife, Helga Zepp LaRouche, the founder and chairwoman of the Schiller Institute, has continued that fight and put forward the idea of the need to move to a new paradigm, a new strategic and development architecture to replace geopolitics. This included the role of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, which is establishing corridors of development connecting many countries culturally, economically, politically. And we're seeing this in the Eurasian perspective developed by Vladimir Putin, especially leading up to the BRICS summit of last week. Cooperation for mutual benefit. That's the idea. So we had events on Saturday and Sunday in New York City in which this idea was put forward by 2 independent candidates, Diane Sare, running for U.S. Senate in New York, and Jose Vega, a congressional candidate from the Bronx in New York. And it included military veterans, analysts, podcasters, comedians, a broad array of people, combined with classical music, the performance of pieces of music which reflected the universal desire of mankind for a peaceful era of development, of cooperation. So the potential is there. It's enormous because, as I said, this current system can't survive as it is, and to try and protect it is moving us to the edge of nuclear conflict. The U.S. presidential election, unfortunately, won't resolve it unless we continue to build on the idea of the International Peace Coalition and what was presented by the Sare and Vega campaigns that we can move to a new paradigm. Now, I'm putting a link to that video from Saturday's event again at the description section. Take some time to listen to it and think about this question of what is one's life worth? Do we wish to live under a world dominated by this geopolitical immorality? Or can we find in ourselves the desire to fight for a common human purpose? And there's nothing more important now than citizens of the West joining with us in a mobilization to change the axioms which dominate almost all political parties in the West. Now is the time to put an end to geopolitics, an end of 500 years of colonialism. Your lives and those of your children depend on winning this fight.